We do have a lot of systems that are around for a very long time, and they're expensive in part to operate because they might run on older programming languages, older technology. But you're also trying to slap cyber on these things that weren't maybe built with cyber in mind. And so that's a heavy lift as well.
Welcome to CyberCast, decoding today's cyber issues. I'm Ross John Fortuna, Managing Editor of GovCIO Media and Research. Cybersecurity across government is constantly changing. The Government Accountability Office is charged with auditing and evaluating how agencies are effectively doing their jobs, including protecting the cyber domain and keeping information secure. Dave Hinchman is the Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at GAO, where he's written and overseen reports on IT modernization, cloud computing, and other pressing tech issues in government. He joined me to talk about the changing landscape of cybersecurity, harmonizing cyber policy across agencies, and the future of tech regulation. So many of our listeners and many people in our audience are aware of GAO and its reports, but the Information Technology and Cybersecurity team covers a lot of ground. Can you explain a little bit for those who are not familiar, like what your team covers, what's in the audits, what's in the report, like what your team does?
Absolutely. And you're right. We do cover a lot of ground, whereas a lot of the mission teams in GAO might focus on defense or environmental issues or contracting. We cover IT and cybersecurity, which stretches across the government and increasingly is part of literally everything we do, both as a government and how we as citizens interact with the government. As you mentioned, you didn't mention, but we are a legislative branch agency. We work for Congress, and we help Congress better understand a lot of the issues facing the nation, whether in oversight, potential legislation, or an advisory capacity. And most often our work is reflected in products that we issue, actual reports that we write for Congress that do deep dives into specific issues. We often make recommendations, which we then follow up over a couple of years on how that government operations can be improved. So in IT and cybersecurity, for the longest time, we did a lot of systems implementation work. The government builds these huge monolithic systems. Historically, the government has not done that well, or at least there's been a lot of room needed for improvement. But increasingly over the last decade, as those systems become interconnected and go online and provide us electronic services, there's a cybersecurity component to that because they're connected. There's a way that a bad actor could get into a system. And so increasingly, our work has involved at least some focus of cybersecurity, if not the sole focus of the work that we do, looking at government IT.
I was reading the June report that you had authored on harmonizing regulatory policy for cybersecurity, what the National Cybersecurity Strategy and Implementation Plan does. Give me a little bit of a download on the report in our audience, what the report is and what was addressed, what isn't addressed, and how the National Cybersecurity Strategy is working to get this all together.
Absolutely. So that report was in support of testimony that I was invited to give in front of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. Chairman Peters has been very interested in this issue for a long time, has recently introduced legislation to resolve what's essentially a conflict that's out there in government cybersecurity regulations. Over time, as tends to happen, especially in a large bureaucracy, you get little pockets of things that grow up. And, maybe there's, say the EPA deals with water providers and water systems. And so they'll pass regulations that pertain to those providers. And over time, you get lots of little pockets of regulations that grow up that might be in conflict with each other, that might duplicate each other. And then you also have efforts by the federal government to pass regulations that affect everyone within the government. And a good example of that is the notice of proposed rulemaking that DHS's CIS office recently made to support CyberCIO, which is the Cybersecurity Incident Reporting Something Act. And that's out there and it's proposed, but there are a lot of conflicts even with those and other things. And so Chairman Peters is very interested right now in looking for a way to streamline, and the term of art is harmonize, these regulations so that As a small business, you only have one regulation that you need to worry about and focus on if something bad happens to you or what your cybersecurity responsibilities are. And there's a lot out there, and it's a tough road. But I think it's great that Chairman Peters is pursuing this, as well, both with the hearings the hearing that he held this summer, as well as the law that he proposed, which will form a committee that will start taking a look at this and over a period of time work to resolve some of these potential conflicts and duplications.
In reading the report, one of the things I'm keying in on is this notion of timeframes. And as you said, the term of art is harmonizing these things. Government's big, and cybersecurity, as you said, and the most avid listeners of this podcast know my favorite term, which is the computer is everything. Everyone's got cybersecurity. Every agency has it. So how do you harmonize that within timeframes that are useful in the ever-evolving cyber threat landscape?
I don't know that anyone has a good answer for that. I sure don't. I think that everyone will agree this is something that we need to take seriously. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. And one complication I'll throw out there is that in the absence of federal action, states are likely to pass regulations. And I think a good example that I was able to highlight at the hearing when I testified is I live in Texas. Texas recently passed a law that requires schools to report cyber instances with a certain incidents within a certain amount of time. Well, under the proposed rule that CISA issued this summer, schools are now pulled into that reporting regime if it becomes final. So now you have a school in Texas that's trying to figure out what it needs to report to the state as well as what it needs to report to the federal government. And that's just an example of how in the vacuum, states will pass their own laws because these are things they care about. And so there is a time pressure on that. I think that just getting this process started would be a huge step because we need to understand the landscape first before you can start making changes. You need to figure out what's out there, what needs to be harmonized, what needs to be streamlined so that you can actually go through that process. And yes, this will be a long haul. This is not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's something that needs to be all of government, both on the executive branch, on the legislative, as well as probably with the Chevron decision that passed. There's going to be on the judiciary as well, because there's a lot of parts that need to work in concert together to make this happen.
So with the Chevron decision, how do you see that affecting the regulatory bodies? Because it does put more oomph under legislative action than, expertise in agencies.
We're all still trying to figure that out. And I've talked to our congressional clients on the Hill. I think they're still trying to figure out as well. Certainly, it's no longer business as usual. But I think a good example is, Chevron particularly applied to regulations that are put in place to enforce laws. If the government were to decide on imposing a regulation that is not based on law, does Chevron still apply? I think there are a lot of people want to figure that out. Might take another court case to figure out whether that applies. But meanwhile, you also have, and I think I won't name parties, there are some federal agencies or federal components already claiming they don't need to follow regulations imposed by EPA because of Chevron. Not sure if that's accurate, but I think there are a lot of people who are going to grab hold of this, and it's going to create a little bit more conflict. But I think that going into this process, understanding the constraints from Chevron, which really means that the law passed by Congress has to be fairly specific, and make sure that you are providing based on counsel, experience, bringing all the parties to the table, that the law that you are passing is going to be implemented as intended. Because there isn't as much room for interpretation as there might have been in the past.
Yeah, it definitely is a game changer. I know I've talked to some folks about how that will change things. I want to shift a little bit and talk about the GAO high risk list. Cybersecurity is and has been part of the high risk list for a little while.
Since 1999.
Thousands of recommendations, and government has acted on hundreds of them. How has that changed in the time that you've worked at GAO? How do you see the improvements? How do you see government working, not just within this, harmonization standpoint, but just the improvement on cybersecurity in general?
Yeah. So I started at GAO in 2002. For the first 8 years of my career, I focused primarily on homeland security issues. specifically a lot of the technology they were building for the border to better control and manage people going across and back. And so I don't know that I was all that cognizant of cybersecurity just because of where I was sort of burying my head and paying attention to. And I think a lot of people just sort of the cyber was this afterthought. It's this thing, you deploy a system and then you make sure no one can hack into it without really understanding what it really means. I applaud, my forerunners at GAO who first looked at what they called information security in 1999 when it went on the high list. But even that had morphed within the agency because by 2003 we were adding critical infrastructure as part of this idea. So I think at that point we were already looking at it as this systemic issue that needed to be addressed. Within the federal government writ large, I think that starting around 2010, the mindset started to change. That's when I switched from the Homeland Security work to looking at data center optimization. And one of the primary reasons that the government was optimizing its data center count was because each of those data centers run by the government and maybe not managed as well as it needed to, not getting the upgrades and the updates it needed to, was a security threat. And so Vivek Kundra, who is the first true federal CIO by name, I think had that vision that he wanted to understand how cybersecurity played in both the data center world, and obviously you move from data centers into cloud computing. And so as my work has shifted, I've become a lot more aware of cyber. I think I understand it from a much more nuanced perspective. But I think sort of within society and with government at large, I would argue that even in the last 5 or 6 years, the government's perspective on cyber has changed radically. And if you think about it in our personal lives, maybe call it 8, 9 years ago, we started hearing about bad actors who would get on our personal computers at home and lock it and hold it hostage. And that's the beginning of ransomware. And now ransomware has morphed from not so much attacking individuals, at least on scale, but going after large entities. And in the government, it's a huge problem with schools, with small municipalities. And so I think there's a real awareness that we need to build cyber in from day one. When you start thinking about any technology, you need to understand the cyber implications. You need to make sure that you are putting the controls in place when you start, because if you try to come in after the fact, as complex as our systems are now, you're going to have a long road ahead of you to try to build that cyber in after the fact. And that, a slight tangent gets us into the burden of legacy IT that the government has. We do have a lot of systems that are around for a very long time, and they're expensive in part to operate because they might run on older programming languages, older technology. But you're also trying to slap cyber on these things that weren't maybe built with cyber in mind. And so that's a heavy lift as well. So, getting the government away from the legacy IT systems onto newer platforms, modern technology that much more easily adapt to changing cyber environments. And the cyber environment is changing as you and I sit here talking. Bad actors are coming up with new ways to get at things. You skim the headlines, some new vulnerability that's been in some software for 10 years is finally getting patched. And it's a constant battle, and it's going to be, I think. As long as we rely on technology, and as technology grows in the government, making available citizen services that are available from our home desk, it's going to be something the government has to have front of mind always.
Yeah, certainly. I know the last 4 years with so many things moving online and web services, sort of necessity being the mother of invention of pandemic lockdowns and such. CX is critically important on the digital side. Because you said the word modernization, I wanted to touch on another report that you'd written in a few months ago on the IRS and IRS's modernization plans. I know that's a similar kind of thing, albeit adjacent. IRS touches everybody, obviously, and has these huge systems. And we've talked here about it. I've talked with IRS officials about it as well. Schedule, performance, cost, things like that. What do you see as the hurdles in the IT modernization at the Internal Revenue Service?
So we've been doing work at the IRS for a long time. Their business systems modernization effort has been underway for 2 decades. There are a couple of primary systems that tend to, unfortunately, be the standard bearer for why that has taken so long. the individual master file, which is the system that manages the tax returns that you and I as citizens file every year. It's one of IRS's largest systems. It has been problematic, to say the least, to upgrade it to a modern platform. It's written in COBOL, which is a language no longer even taught in the schools. Increasingly fewer people who can maintain that language, but they're working to modernize it. They got a pretty good hunk of change in the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know that has been a political hot potato, and the IRS has had some of that money rescinded, but none of the money that was earmarked for business systems modernization was taken back. So that's about $5 billion they got in that. And they're making progress. They hope to have that system migrated to the new platform by the end of the decade, if not sooner. And one of the things that we've looked at in our work, because we have a standing mandate to go in and look at IRS every year for the Appropriations Committee in both House and Senate, is what that progress looks like. And there have been fits and starts. There's been reallocation of resources. The injection of the Inflation Reduction Act money has made a big difference. And so, they've moved all of this into what they call a strategic operating plan, which is the agency's grand vision for how they're getting to the end line on their modernization effort. It's still, many years to go, and they're working to define the longer term plans while they manage to the nearer term ones. But one of the things we did look at, as you mentioned, is what their modernization plans looks like. We looked at, I think it was 21 different initiatives. And then we have sort of, from GAO, when we look at these things, we have sort of three main components we look at. And what we found missing the most was, what are the plans for the technology you're getting rid of? And I think if you see, there was a report from the IRS's Office of, essentially their Office of the Inspector General, which is called TIGTA, Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, who took a very deep dive and found that a lot of that information was missing. And there wasn't sure what the plans were to get rid of these older systems that are being replaced. So there's work to be done. We're starting up our next effort to look at IRS. This is one of the topics we're going to touch on with them. One of the things I like about doing these annual reviews with IRS is we really get a chance to continually engage with the same people and work with them to better understand what their plans are as they work towards their modernization goals.
Certainly a huge task. So it's always interesting to see how they are working on that. I mean, certainly it's not without a lot of effort and a lot of needs, for sure. EPA, I know, is one report. You've written about EPA and critical infrastructure, but you certainly have covered, again, IRS and all these things. Are there through lines and sort of continual issues, particularly with cybersecurity, that hit all of these different agencies that you have to audit?
Yeah, and I think I would even up-level it a little bit more to focus on agencies. I think isn't quite right. Cybersecurity is something that impacts all of us. It's things we need to worry about in our personal lives as we bank on our phones, as we share, we send emails, your phone connection or your connection at home or your Wi-Fi. Those are all points where a bad person can get in and dramatically complicate our lives if they want to. And I think similarly, as agencies move out and provide their citizen services, as they fulfill their mission, they rely on technology. And so everyone has to think about technology. We call it cyber hygiene. It starts with making it clear to everyone in your organization, from the highest level in the secretary's office down to the guy in the loading dock, that you are responsible for cybersecurity. You need to be worry about phishing emails that come in, or someone trying to spearfish you, or hack your credentials. And so it starts there, but then it also, it becomes a culture of building cyber, so that everyone thinks about it in a positive way, that they're very aware of it, that you have executive sponsorship for these efforts from the get-go, and that when you're planning new projects, you are building cyber in from day one and really understanding what that's going to look like, so that, do you need to incorporate zero trust authority? Do you need to have access management? If you're starting a new cloud computing contract with a new vendor, do you really get each other? Are they going to provide the services that you need? Are you really going to be the customer that they're looking for. And I think that's an important part because you're building these relationships, both internal to the organization as well as external, with the idea that we all want our information to be safe. And so making sure that that's, front of mind, I think is a phrase I've used a couple times today because that's kind of how I think about it. It needs to be something that is one of our very first considerations for any technology interaction, whether you're building a new system or logging onto a website to get information on something.
Yeah, I know you referenced this during this conversation. I know the Secure by Design pledge, I know, has been a big part of the way they're dealing with industry and generally, but you wouldn't build a house without a door. You wouldn't build a car without door locks. You want to have even the most basic designs in to make sure you've kept things safer from the outside world.
When I started at GAO, we were just the information technology team. And I mentioned to you that historical evolution of what cyber meant to the government and sort of the role it played and the prominence it had. And so we added cybersecurity to my team's name several years ago. We became the IT and cybersecurity team. And that, I think, really demonstrates how important it is to all of us, whether you're in the government, in your private life, private sector. And you mentioned the Secure by Design. How do we get the private sector firms that sell us hardware, sell us software, to have that same mindset? They are building cyber in from day one, right? So, and I think, there have been a couple of, we'll just call them very prominent incidences in the last couple of months where that maybe wasn't true. When you've got a huge sprawling enterprise, there are a lot of parts and pieces, and making sure that you're tracking all those parts and pieces, that they're all doing what they need to do, is a lot of work. But again, that comes back to it's an all of government effort. Everyone's got to be part of this, both legislative, executive branch, judicial, so that we are making our lives as secure as possible.
Yeah, like I said, this is confirmation bias from my side, but certainly hearing from you, it's good to hear that the computer is, in fact, everything. Thanks so much for being on the show with us.
Absolutely, Ross. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the chance to be here.
Thanks for listening to CyberCast. I want to thank Dave Hinchman of the Government Accountability Office for joining me this week. Listeners can tune in each week for a brand new podcast episode in our GovCIO Media and Research podcast feed. Make sure you subscribe to that feed, leave a review, and a nice rating for us on the podcast provider of your choice. CyberCast is a production of GovCIO Media and Research and is produced by GovCIO Media and Research Production Lead Alexander Bolova. You can visit our website at govcio.com. You can contact us at newsletter@govcio.com.